On a crisp October morning in 1978, Margaret Sullivan unlocked the door to her modest hair salon on West 72nd Street in Manhattan, breathing in the familiar scent of shampoo and hairspray, unaware that the woman who would sit in her chair that afternoon would shatter everything she thought she knew about trust. For 3 years, she had considered Elena Sorensen a friend, a confidant, a regular client who tipped generously and shared stories about her Canadian upbringing with an accent so slight it seemed authentic. What Margaret believed about their relationship, about Elena's identity, about the quiet rhythms of life in New York City during the Cold War, would prove to be entirely, devastatingly wrong. This is the story of how an ordinary hairdresser became an unwitting witness to one of the most sophisticated espionage operations ever conducted on American soil, and how a single moment of observation would set in motion a chain of events that would expose the hidden world of Soviet sleeper agents living among everyday Americans. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Margaret Sullivan had opened her salon, Silk and Scissors, in the spring of 1975, just after her 40th birthday and her divorce from Robert, fair stockbroker who had traded their marriage for a younger woman and a brownstone in Brooklyn. The salon occupied a narrow storefront between a delicatessen and a shoe repair shop, with large windows that let in afternoon sunlight and a bell that chimed whenever customers entered. Margaret had decorated the space herself with cream-colored wallpaper, vintage mirrors with ornate gold frames, and 3 swiveling chairs upholstered in pale blue vinyl. The neighborhood was a mix of young professionals, elderly Jewish immigrants, and families who had lived in the same apartments for generations. Everyone knew everyone, or so it seemed. Elena Sorensen first walked through the door in November of 1975, a tall woman in her early 30s with honey blonde hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes the color of winter ice. She wore an expensive camel hair coat and leather gloves, carrying herself with a posture that suggested ballet training or military discipline. Margaret remembered the encounter vividly because Elena had apologized for not having an appointment, her voice carrying the slightest trace of what sounded like a Canadian accent, soft vowels that could have come from Toronto or Montreal. She needed a trim, nothing dramatic, and she paid cash, leaving a 20% tip that made Margaret smile. Over the following months, Elena became a regular, scheduling appointments every 6 weeks with the precision of someone who kept a detailed calendar. She always arrived exactly on time, never early, never late. During their sessions, she would talk about her work as a freelance translator, specializing in French and German documents for various clients in the publishing industry. She mentioned living in a small apartment near Columbus Circle, described weekend trips to museums, and occasionally referenced her childhood in Canada. Though the details remained vague, her father had been a civil engineer, she said once. Her mother had died when she was young. She had no siblings. These fragments of biography accumulated slowly, like layers of paint that created the illusion of a complete portrait. Margaret, who had developed the hairdresser's gift for reading people through their reflections in the mirror, noticed small details about Elena that intrigued her. The woman never wore jewelry except for a simple gold watch with no inscription. Her clothing was expensive but understated, mostly neutral colors that would not stand out in a crowd. She carried different handbags, rotating through at least 5 or 6, but they were all practical styles with secure closures, never the trendy, oversized totes that other young women favored. Her hands were elegant but strong, the nails cut short and unpolished. When she sat in the chair, she held herself very still, as though conserving energy, and her eyes would occasionally track movement on the street outside, with an intensity that seemed beyond casual observation. The friendship between them grew slowly, organically, built on the intimacy that sometimes develops between a hairdresser and a regular client. Margaret would share stories about her struggle to keep the salon profitable, about her daughter Amanda, who was studying art history at Barnard College, about her attempts to navigate the dating scene as a divorced woman in her 40s. Eleanor would listen with what seemed like genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and occasionally offering advice that was both practical and kind. She recommended restaurants, suggested books, and once gave Margaret a beautiful silk scarf for Christmas, wrapped in silver paper with a card that read simply, "To friendship, Elena." By the fall of 1978, Margaret considered Elena one of her closest friends, despite the fact that their relationship existed primarily within the confines of the salon and occasional coffee dates at a nearby diner. They had never been to each other's apartments, never attended social events together, never spoken on the phone for longer than a few minutes to confirm appointments. This boundary, which Margaret attributed to Elena's reserved personality and busy schedule, would later seem like the most obvious warning sign she had missed. The day that changed everything began ordinarily enough. It was a Thursday afternoon in late October, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. Eleanor arrived at 2:30 for her regular appointment, wearing a dark wool coat and carrying a leather briefcase along with her usual handbag. Margaret noticed the briefcase immediately because Eleanor had never brought one to the salon before. When Margaret commented on it, Eleanor explained casually that she had a meeting with a client later that evening and did not want to return home first. Her voice remained steady, her expression unchanged, but something in her eyes flickered for just a moment, a micro-expression that Margaret could not quite interpret. As Margaret shampooed Elena's hair, running her fingers through the thick strands and massaging her scalp with practiced movements, Elena closed her eyes and seemed to relax into the warm water and rhythmic pressure. This was the part of the appointment when clients often became most talkative, lulled by physical comfort into sharing confidences. But today Elena remained silent, her breathing slow and even, her body unusually tense despite the soothing environment. Margaret wrapped Elena's hair in a towel and guided her back to the chair. As she began combing through the wet hair, sectioning it for the cut, Elena's handbag slipped from where it had been resting against the chair leg and fell open on the floor. The contents spilled across the black and white checkered tiles. A wallet, a compact mirror, a tube of lipstick, a pair of sunglasses, a paperback novel with a German title, and something else that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. It was a passport, but not an American or Canadian one. The cover was deep red, and as Margaret bent to help gather the scattered items, she glimpsed text in Cyrillic letters before Eleanor snatched it away with a speed that seemed almost violent. Their eyes met in the mirror, and for the first time in 3 years Margaret saw something in Elena's face that frightened her. It was not anger or embarrassment, but rather a cold, calculating assessment, as though Elena was deciding in that instant whether Margaret posed a threat. Margaret said, her voice carefully light, "Oh, I did not know you traveled to Russia. How interesting." Elena's expression smoothed into a smile that did not reach her eyes. She replied, "For work, sometimes. I translate Russian documents occasionally as well. It is easier to have the proper identification for business trips." The explanation sounded plausible, delivered with the same calm tone Elena always used, but Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she resumed cutting. The passport had been red, distinctly red, and while Margaret was not an expert on such things, she remembered reading somewhere that Soviet passports were that particular shade of crimson. But why would a Canadian woman who worked as a freelance translator need a Soviet passport? And why had Elena reacted with such alarm when it fell out? Margaret continued the haircut on autopilot, her mind racing through 3 years of conversations, searching for inconsistencies she might have missed. Eleanor had always been vague about her background, she realized now, offering details that created an impression without providing verifiable facts. She had never mentioned specific places in Canada, never shared photographs, never spoken about childhood friends or relatives who could be contacted. The stories she told about her work never included client names or specific projects. Even her apartment near Columbus Circle, which Margaret had never seen, might not exist at all. Eleanor sat perfectly still in the chair, watching Margaret's reflection with an intensity that made the younger woman's stomach twist with anxiety. The salon suddenly felt too quiet, too isolated, despite the sounds of traffic outside and the hum of the refrigerator in the small back room where Margaret stored her supplies. The afternoon light had grown dim as storm clouds gathered, casting shadows across Elena's face that made her features seem foreign, unfamiliar, as though Margaret was seeing her for the first time. When the haircut was finished, Margaret used the blow-dryer with hands that had steadied through sheer force of will, styling Elena's hair into the sleek bob she preferred. Elena watched the process in the mirror without speaking, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. The silence between them had weight now, heavy with unspoken questions and the metallic taste of fear. Margaret's mind kept circling back to the red passport, to Elena's reaction, to the growing certainty that something was deeply, dangerously wrong. Elena paid in cash, as always, counting out crisp $20 bills from her wallet with mechanical precision. She left her usual generous tip, gathered her belongings with careful deliberation and paused at the door. For a moment, Margaret thought Elena might say something, might offer another explanation or issue a warning, but instead she simply smiled, a small, sad expression that contained what might have been regret, and walked out into the grey afternoon. Margaret locked the door behind her, flipping the sign to closed, even though it was only 4 o'clock and she had 2 more appointments scheduled. Her legs felt weak, and she sank into one of the salon chairs, staring at her own reflection in the mirror, and wondering if she had just imagined the entire encounter, if her mind had conjured danger from innocent circumstances. But the memory of that red passport remained vivid, undeniable, and with it came a flood of recollections that suddenly seemed sinister rather than merely quirky. Elena's habit of arriving and leaving on a precise schedule, her rotation of different handbags and clothing that helped her blend into any environment, the way she asked questions about Margaret's life, about the neighborhood, about the other clients who came to the salon, gathering information with the skill of someone trained to extract intelligence from casual conversation. The fact that in 3 years, despite their supposed friendship, Margaret knew almost nothing concrete about Elena's life beyond the salon walls. Margaret spent that evening unable to eat, unable to focus on the television program she turned on for distraction, unable to shake the feeling that she had stumbled into something far beyond her understanding. She considered calling the police, but what would she say? That a client had dropped a foreign passport and acted strangely, that she suspected based on nothing but instinct and a flash of Cyrillic letters, that her friend might be someone other than who she claimed. It sounded absurd, even in her own mind, the paranoid fantasy of someone who had watched too many spy movies. But the Cold War was not a movie. It was the reality of living in 1978, when the Soviet Union and the United States remained locked in a struggle that played out through proxy wars, arms races, and espionage operations that most Americans never saw. Margaret read the newspapers. She knew about the tensions between the superpowers, about Soviet infiltration attempts, about the FBI's ongoing efforts to identify foreign agents operating on American soil. She had simply never imagined that such things could touch her own life, that danger could sit in her salon chair and chat about the weather while maintaining a false identity with practiced ease. The following morning, Margaret called the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in Manhattan, her voice shaking as she asked to speak with someone about a possible security matter. The receptionist transferred her to an agent who listened to her story with patient professionalism, asking questions about Elena's appearance, her schedule, the details she had shared about her background. The agent, who identified himself only as Special Agent Morrison, did not dismiss her concerns or suggest she was overreacting. Instead, he asked if Margaret would be willing to meet with him and provide a more detailed statement. They met that afternoon at a coffee shop 6 blocks from the salon, a neutral location where their conversation would not attract attention. Agent Morrison was a man in his early 50s, with grey hair and tired eyes that had seen enough of human deception to recognize when someone was telling the truth. He carried a leather notebook and a pen, but he did not take it out immediately. Instead, he ordered coffee for both of them and waited while Margaret organized her thoughts, her hands wrapped around the warm cup as though seeking comfort from its heat. Margaret told him everything. She described Elena's first visit to the salon 3 years earlier, the slow development of their friendship, the small details that had seemed merely characteristic of a private person, but now appeared to be the carefully constructed elements of a cover identity. She described the red passport, Eleanor's reaction when it fell from her handbag, the cold assessment in her eyes that had replaced warmth with calculation. Agent Morrison listened without interruption, his expression neutral, but his attention absolute. When Margaret finished, Agent Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. Finally, he said, "Mrs. Sullivan, what I am about to tell you must remain completely confidential. You cannot discuss this with anyone, not your daughter, not your friends, not other clients at your salon. Do you understand?" Margaret nodded, her mouth dry despite the coffee she had been sipping. Morrison continued, his voice low and serious. "We have been aware of a sophisticated Soviet intelligence operation involving what we call illegal agents, or sleeper agents, living in the United States under false identities. These are not diplomats or embassy personnel who have official cover. These are highly trained operatives who spend years, sometimes decades, building believable backgrounds and integrating into American society. They work regular jobs, maintain social relationships, and wait for activation orders that may never come, or they slowly cultivate access to sensitive information through the networks they build." Margaret felt her chest tighten as the implications crystallized. She asked, "Are you saying Elena is one of these agents?" Morrison replied carefully, "I am saying that the details you have provided match the profile of someone we have been trying to identify. The woman you know as Elena Sorensen may not be Canadian at all. She may be a Soviet citizen who was given extensive training in languages, cultural behaviors, and tradecraft before being inserted into the United States with forged documents and a fabricated history." The words seemed impossible, too dramatic to be real, but Margaret remembered Elena's face in the mirror, that flash of cold evaluation that had replaced 3 years of friendly warmth. She asked, "What happens now? What should I do?" Agent Morrison leaned forward slightly, his voice becoming even quieter. He said, "You continue exactly as you have been. If Elena contacts you for another appointment, you accept it. You treat her normally, maintain your friendship, give no indication that anything has changed. We need to observe her patterns, identify her contacts, understand her network before we can take action. And Mrs. Sullivan, you need to understand something crucial. If our suspicions are correct, if Elena is indeed a Soviet agent, then she may perceive you as a threat. She will be watching you for signs of suspicion or unusual behavior. Your safety depends on your ability to act naturally." Fear crawled up Margaret's spine like ice water. She whispered, "You are asking me to pretend everything is normal, while knowing that my friend, or the woman I thought was my friend, might be a spy. While knowing she might consider me a security risk?" Morrison's expression softened with something that might have been sympathy. He said, "I am asking you to be brave, Mrs. Sullivan. You have already shown remarkable courage by coming forward. What you do next could help protect national security and potentially expose a network of foreign agents operating in our country. But I will not lie to you about the risks. If you do not feel you can continue this relationship without revealing your knowledge, we will understand. We can work around it. The choice is yours." Margaret thought about her daughter Amanda, about the life she had built after her divorce, about the salon that represented her independence and resilience. She thought about the other clients who trusted her, about the neighborhood she loved, about the country she had never questioned her loyalty to until this moment. And she thought about Elena, or whoever the woman really was, sitting in her chair with secrets hidden beneath a carefully constructed facade. She met Morrison's eyes and said, "Tell me exactly what you need me to do." Over the following weeks, Margaret became an unwitting participant in a counterintelligence operation that operated in the shadows of her ordinary life. Agent Morrison provided her with a contact number she could call at any hour if she observed anything unusual or felt threatened. He instructed her on how to document Elena's visits without being obvious about it, noting the dates and times, any changes in her appearance or behavior, any new details she mentioned about her life or work. He taught her basic surveillance detection techniques, ways to notice if she was being followed, signs that her apartment or salon might have been entered while she was away. Elena called 3 weeks after the incident with the passport to schedule another appointment. Her voice on the phone sounded normal, friendly, unchanged. She asked how Margaret had been, mentioned that the weather was turning cold, and requested her usual time slot on a Thursday afternoon. Margaret confirmed the appointment with a steadiness that surprised her. her voice betraying none of the anxiety that made her hands shake as she hung up the phone. She called Agent Morrison immediately after, and he assured her that surveillance would be in place, that agents would be watching the salon from discreet locations, that she would not be alone, even though it would feel that way. He reminded her to act naturally, to maintain the comfortable rhythm of their previous appointments, to observe but not to interrogate. When Elena walked through the salon door on that Thursday afternoon in mid-November, Margaret felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she managed a smile that she hoped looked genuine. Elena seemed relaxed, wearing a burgundy sweater and black slacks, her hair slightly longer than usual and in need of the trim she had scheduled. She hung her coat on the rack by the door, set her handbag carefully beside the chair, and settled into the seat with a small sigh of contentment. Eleanor said, "I have been looking forward to this all week. You always make me feel so refreshed." Margaret began the familiar ritual of shampooing and conditioning, her fingers moving through Elena's hair with practiced motions, while her mind raced with questions she could not ask. Who was this woman really? What was her real name? Where had she been born and trained? What secrets had she collected during her time in the United States, sitting in this very chair and listening to Margaret's innocent chatter about her life and neighbors? As Margaret cut and styled Elena's hair, their conversation flowed with the ease of long familiarity. Elena talked about a translation project she was working on, a German technical manual that was proving particularly challenging. She asked about Amanda and whether she was enjoying her classes at Barnard. She mentioned planning a trip to Boston in December to visit a museum exhibition. Every word sounded natural, unrehearsable, yet Margaret now heard each statement as a potential lie, another layer in an elaborate construction of false identity. The appointment proceeded without incident. Elena paid in cash, left her usual tip, and departed with a warm smile and a promise to call in 6 weeks for her next visit. Margaret watched through the salon window as Elena walked down the sidewalk and disappeared around the corner, wondering if FBI agents were following her, if anyone would ever truly know where she went or what she did in the hours between their appointments. That evening, Margaret met with Agent Morrison again, this time in his office at the FBI field headquarters, a gray building with security checkpoints and fluorescent lighting that hummed overhead. She described the appointment in detail, and Morrison recorded her observations in his notebook, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed how carefully he was analyzing every piece of information. Morrison finally said, "You did very well, Mrs. Sullivan. We had agents conducting surveillance, and they followed your client after she left the salon. She went to a bookstore in Greenwich Village, purchased 3 books, browsed for 45 minutes, then took the subway to Queens. She got off at Forest Hills and walked to an apartment building on 71st Avenue. She entered using a key, suggesting she either lives there or has access to the residence. We are working on identifying the apartment's registered tenant." Margaret absorbed this information with a mix of relief and unease. The investigation was progressing, but it also meant that Elena's deception was even more extensive than she had imagined. The woman had multiple locations, multiple identities perhaps, a shadow life that existed parallel to the persona she presented at the salon. She asked, "How long will this continue? How long do I have to keep pretending?" Morrison's expression was sympathetic, but firm. He replied, "As long as necessary to build a complete picture of her network. Soviet sleeper agents rarely work alone, Mrs. Sullivan. They have handlers, contacts, other agents they communicate with through various methods. We need to identify those connections before we can act. If we arrest Elena prematurely, we alert the entire network and lose the opportunity to dismantle it completely." Margaret returned home that night feeling the weight of her dual existence. At the salon, she remained cheerful and professional, cutting hair and chatting with clients about their lives while maintaining the facade of normalcy. But underneath, she was constantly aware of the surveillance operations happening around her, of the agents watching from unmarked cars, of the possibility that Elena might discover she had been compromised and take action to protect herself or her mission. The weeks leading up to Christmas 1978 passed in a blur of ordinary routines shadowed by extraordinary tension. Elena kept her appointments with clockwork regularity, never varying from her established pattern, never revealing anything that suggested awareness of being watched. She gave Margaret another gift, a leather-bound journal with cream-colored pages, inscribed with a message wishing her joy in the coming year. The gesture felt both touching and chilling, a reminder of the emotional manipulation inherent in successful espionage. In early January of 1979, Agent Morrison called Margaret with news. The investigation had made significant progress. Through surveillance and careful intelligence work, the FBI had identified several individuals who appeared to be part of Elena's network. There was a man who worked as a photographer, meeting Elena occasionally at cafes where they would exchange newspapers in a manner that suggested dead-drop techniques. There was a woman who taught at a community college, crossing paths with Elena at cultural events, with a frequency that seemed coordinated rather than coincidental. The web of connections was slowly becoming visible, and with it came the magnitude of the operation Elena was part of. Morrison said, "We believe your client is what the Soviets call an illegal resident, someone who serves as a node in the network, coordinating information flow between other agents and maintaining contact with Moscow through encrypted communications." The level of sophistication we are seeing suggests this operation has been in place for many years, possibly since the early 1970s. Margaret felt nauseous imagining the scope of betrayal. She asked, "When will you arrest them?" Morrison replied, "Soon. We are coordinating with other field offices because we believe this network extends beyond New York. We want to make simultaneous arrests to prevent any members from fleeing once we move on the first target. When it happens, it will be swift and comprehensive. And Mrs. Sullivan, I want you to know that your cooperation has been invaluable. You may very well have helped prevent significant intelligence losses for our country." The arrests occurred on a cold morning in mid-February. Margaret heard about it first on the news before Agent Morrison called to confirm. The television showed footage of FBI agents leading multiple individuals from various locations in New York City, their faces captured by cameras as they were placed in unmarked vehicles. The reporter described it as a major counterintelligence operation, the dismantling of a Soviet spy ring that had been operating undetected for years. Elena's face appeared on the screen for just a moment, her expression blank and impassive, as agents escorted her from an apartment building in Queens. Her hair was different, cut shorter and dyed darker than Margaret remembered, as though she had been preparing to change identities again. The name given by the reporter was not Elena Sorensen, but Anna Kovalenko, a Soviet citizen who had entered the United States in 1974 under a false Canadian identity, trained by the KGB's elite illegals program to establish deep cover and gather intelligence on American society and potential targets for recruitment. Margaret sat in her living room, watching the news coverage with tears streaming down her face, grieving for a friendship that had never been real, for trust that had been weaponized, for the innocence she had lost in discovering that danger could hide behind a familiar smile. She thought about all the conversations they had shared, all the moments of apparent intimacy that had been nothing more than tradecraft, calculated performances designed to maintain a cover identity and extract information from an unwitting source. Agent Morrison visited her that evening, bringing coffee and sitting with her in comfortable silence before speaking. He said, "I know this is difficult, Mrs. Sullivan. You formed a real connection with someone who was not who she claimed to be. That betrayal cuts deep, and I want you to know that what you are feeling is entirely valid." Margaret wiped her eyes and asked, "Was any of it real? Did she feel anything genuine in all those hours we spent together?" Morrison considered the question carefully before responding. He said, "Soviet sleeper agents are trained to compartmentalize, to separate their mission from their personal feelings. But they are still human beings, Mrs. Sullivan. Anna Kovalenko, or whatever her real name is, spent years building a life here. She learned to speak English without an accent, to understand American culture, to navigate relationships and daily interactions. It is possible that some part of her genuinely valued your kindness, even as she maintained her cover. But ultimately, her primary loyalty was always to her mission and her country. That is the tragedy of espionage. It requires people to live inside lies so completely that they lose themselves in the process. In the months that followed, Margaret learned more about the extent of Anna Kovalenko's operation through media reports, and occasional briefings from Agent Morrison. Anna had been part of a network of at least 15 Soviet illegals operating in the northeastern United States, gathering intelligence on a range of targets from defense contractors to academic researchers working on sensitive technologies. The information they collected was transmitted to Moscow through a sophisticated system of encrypted radio transmissions, dead drops, and occasional meetings with diplomatic personnel who had legal cover. The trial, when it occurred, was relatively brief. Anna and several other members of the network pleaded guilty to charges of espionage and acting as unregistered foreign agents. In exchange for their cooperation in providing information about Soviet intelligence methods and operations, they received reduced sentences. Anna was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, but would likely be released much sooner as part of a prisoner exchange program that allowed captured spies to return to their home countries in trade for American agents held by the Soviets. Margaret attended one day of the trial, sitting in the public gallery and watching as Anna was led into the courtroom in handcuffs. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Margaret saw something in Anna's expression that might have been remorse or simply resignation. Anna looked older, thinner, diminished by confinement and the collapse of the identity she had maintained for so many years. She no longer resembled the elegant, confident woman who had walked into Silk and Scissors salon in November of 1975. After the trial concluded, Margaret tried to return to her normal life, but the experience had changed her in ways both subtle and profound. She looked at her clients differently now, aware that anyone could be hiding secrets, that the surface of human interaction often concealed depths that remained invisible until circumstance revealed them. She installed better locks on the salon door, became more cautious about sharing personal information, and found herself analyzing conversations for inconsistencies or evasions that might signal deception. Her daughter Amanda came home from Barnard that spring and listened with wide eyes as Margaret finally told her the full story of what had happened. Amanda held her mother's hand and said, "Mom, you were so brave. You could have ignored what you saw, convinced yourself it was nothing, but you trusted your instincts and did the right thing even though it was scary." Margaret smiled at her daughter's faith in her courage, though she herself felt more fragile than brave, more shaken than heroic. She replied, "I just did what anyone would do when faced with a choice between safety and responsibility. But I will tell you this, Amanda, I never want to go through anything like that again. The not knowing, the constant vigilance, the weight of keeping such enormous secrets, it changes you in ways I am still discovering." The impact of the case extended beyond Margaret's personal experience. The arrests and subsequent trials sent shockwaves through the intelligence community and sparked renewed debates about Soviet penetration of American society. Congressional hearings examined how the KGB had managed to place so many illegal agents in the United States without detection, questioning whether counterintelligence resources were adequate to address the threat. The FBI launched intensive reviews of visa procedures and background check protocols, searching for vulnerabilities that had allowed Anna and others like her to establish their false identities so successfully. For the American public, the case served as a stark reminder that the Cold War was not merely an abstract geopolitical struggle, but a conflict that played out in neighborhoods and communities across the country. Soviet spies were not always dramatic figures from thriller novels, but could be neighbors, co-workers, friends whose carefully constructed facades concealed their true allegiances. The paranoia of the 1950s, which had led to the excesses of McCarthyism and the Red Scare, found new expression in the anxieties of the late 1970s, though tempered by a more sophisticated understanding of how modern espionage actually functioned. Margaret received a letter from the FBI director several months after the trial, commending her for her vigilance and cooperation in an investigation that had successfully dismantled a significant Soviet intelligence network. The letter was formal and brief, acknowledging her contribution to national security while maintaining the confidentiality required by ongoing counterintelligence operations. She kept it in a drawer with other important documents, a piece of paper that validated her experience, but could not erase the emotional cost of having been so thoroughly deceived. The salon continued to operate, and Margaret gradually rebuilt her sense of security and trust. New clients came through the door, and she welcomed them with her characteristic warmth while maintaining a slight reserve, a protective distance she had not felt necessary before. Some of her regular customers asked about Elena, having read about the spy ring in the newspapers and recognizing the woman who had once been a fixture at Silk and Scissors. Margaret would simply say that she had been as surprised as anyone, that people were not always who they appeared to be, and then she would change the subject to more comfortable topics. Years later, in the mid-1980s, when tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union reached new heights under President Reagan's administration, Margaret would occasionally think about Anna Kovalenko and wonder what had become of her. Had she been exchanged back to Moscow, as Morrison had suggested was likely? Had she been welcomed as a hero of the Soviet intelligence services, or punished for the failure of her mission? Had she ever thought about the hairdresser in Manhattan who had accidentally discovered her secret, whose sharp eyes and quick mind had set in motion the unraveling of years of careful work? Margaret would never know the answers to those questions. The world of espionage operated behind veils of secrecy that rarely lifted completely, leaving those caught on its periphery with fragments of truth and endless speculation. But she had learned profound lessons from her encounter with Anna, lessons about the cost of deception, the fragility of trust, and the courage required to act when comfortable ignorance would have been so much easier. She had learned that ordinary people, living ordinary lives, could become part of extraordinary events through simple acts of observation and conscience. She had learned that bravery was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. And she had learned that the Cold War, which seemed so distant in newspaper headlines and television reports, could reach into the most mundane spaces, a hair salon on West 72nd Street, and transform everything. The story of Margaret Sullivan and Anna Kovalenko became a footnote in the larger narrative of Cold War espionage, occasionally referenced in books about Soviet intelligence operations or FBI counterintelligence successes. But for Margaret, it remained the defining experience of her middle age, the moment when she had been called upon to be more than a divorced hairdresser rebuilding her life, and had found within herself reserves of strength and determination she had not known existed. She kept the journal Anna had given her as a Christmas gift, the leather-bound book with cream-colored pages that she had never been able to bring herself to write in. It sat on a shelf in her living room, a physical reminder of the relationship that had been both real and illusory, genuine and manufactured. Sometimes she would take it down and run her fingers over the smooth leather cover, thinking about the woman who had given it to her, trying to separate the person from the performance, the human being from the spy. The Cold War would continue for another decade after Anna's arrest, finally ending with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union. Margaret watched those historic events on television with a complex mix of emotions, feeling relief that the decades-long conflict was finally ending, but also a strange melancholy for all the lives that had been distorted by ideology and suspicion, including Anna's and her own, in their vastly different ways. By then, Margaret had sold Silk and Scissors and retired to a smaller apartment, spending her time with her daughter and grandchildren, attending concerts and museums, rediscovering the pleasures of a life lived without the shadow of secrets and surveillance. But she never forgot the lessons of those months in 1978 and 79, never stopped being grateful that she had found the courage to make that phone call to the FBI, to become part of something larger than herself, even at considerable personal risk. The history of Cold War espionage is filled with dramatic cases of high-level defectors, sophisticated technical operations, and intelligence coups that shaped geopolitical outcomes, but it also includes countless smaller stories of ordinary citizens who found themselves at the intersection of the hidden war between superpowers and chose to act according to their conscience and loyalty. Margaret Sullivan was one of those citizens, a hairdresser whose careful observation and moral courage helped expose a Soviet spy network and protect her country's security in the process. Her story reminds us that the most effective defense against espionage is not merely the work of intelligence agencies and counterintelligence professionals, but the vigilance of ordinary people who remain alert to inconsistencies and anomalies in their daily lives. It demonstrates that trust must be balanced with discernment, that friendship does not require the abandonment of critical thinking, and that sometimes the greatest acts of patriotism occur not on battlefields or in government offices, but in modest salons and quiet neighborhoods where people live their lives unaware that history is unfolding around them. The red passport that fell from a handbag on an October afternoon in 1978 became the thread that, when pulled, unraveled an entire network of deception. Margaret Sullivan saw it, recognized its significance despite her initial doubts, and made the difficult choice to report what she had witnessed. In doing so, she became an unlikely hero of the Cold War, proof that courage and conviction can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the fate of nations turns on the smallest observations of the most ordinary people. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.